At the moment, we've only got one page in our single page application, so we need to define some routing in our front end. And for that, we'll use view router. So let's do that. We'll go to our terminal and run npm install view router. And now we can restart hot reloading. Now let's go to our app.js file and see how we can use that router. To initialize our router, we need to give it as an option to our view instance right here. So we should type router and then define our router configuration as an object right here. But because that router configuration is going to be quite big and complex, I think it would be nice to externalize it in its own folder. So as we've been doing so far, I'd like to have a router instance that gets imported from a router alias, and that alias would encapsulate the entire logic of the router folder. Right, so assuming this router instance is available for us, we can use it in our view options like so. Router equals router. And we can simplify this by simply writing router. And this is exactly equivalent to what we had before. Now, whilst we're here, let's clean this file a little bit. We'll remove the app constant since we're not using it anywhere. And we'll require our bootstrap file using the import notation. Right, so now we have some errors because we're using an alias at router that we did not define. So let's define it right now. We'll go to our webpack config file and add a fourth alias called router. And again, we'll keep that $sign because we'll have an index.js file that encapsulates the logic of the folder. Next, I need to restart hot reloading. So terminal npm run hot. Okay, so now the router alias exists, but the router directory that it points to doesn't. So let's add it. We'll add a new router directory that has an index.js file inside. Okay, so that was enough to make our build successful, but now let's actually define what that router instance is going to be. Okay, so the very first thing that we need to do is make Vue use the Vue Router plugin. So we'll import Vue from Vue and Vue Router from Vue Router. And we'll make Vue use Vue Router. Okay, so now that Vue is using the Vue Router plugin, it's failing because we're not returning our router configurations. So let's do that. We'll return a new router instance. And we'll define two options. The first one is mode history. And that's going to tell our Vue router not to use hashtags to navigate between pages, but to actually push our navigation to our browser history. So that way, instead of having paparazzi.com/hashtag-login, we can simply have /login, which is a lot cleaner. Okay, and our second option will be the routes that we want to define for our application. So for now, I'm just going to say routes empty array. So now if I export that router instance, so export default router, and I save this, not only our build is successful, but we are now ready to define our routes. And this is going to be defined as an array of objects where each object defined a route. That means this array will quickly grow and take over all of our index.js file. So for that reason, I'm going to extract it to its own file. So we'll import routes from routes and use that instance here, which we can again simplify like this. Okay, so let's create that routes file. And all that this file will do is export our array of routes. So export default, and here we will define our routes. Okay, so in this episode, we'll start by defining 3 routes. One for the homepage that we'll reach by clicking on the paparazzi logo right here, and 2 for the login and register pages. Okay, so let's start with the homepage. We'll create a new object here. And we'll start with the path. So because this is the path that we want to reach by default, we'll just add path equals /. Then we need to define which component we want to display. We didn't create those pages component just yet, but let's assume that we have them for now. So we'll write component, and then we'll require components/homepage. And because we're using Laravel Mix, which is using Webpack 4, we also need to add .default. And the last thing we can do is give that route a name, which is going to be helpful when we try and reference it a little bit everywhere in our application. So we'll write name homepage. And you can name your routes whatever you want, but I like to use the convention that names them the same as the component. Okay, now we'll do the same for the login and register page. So I'm going to copy paste that twice. And here we'll say login and here register. For the login page, we'll call that component auth login. And for the register page, we'll call it auth register. Okay, so now to make this work, we need to create the 3pages component. So inside our components directory, we'll create homepage.view. We'll create auth login.view. And we'll create auth register.view. And for now, all we're going to do with these components is make them display a panel with their name on it. So for example, for auth register, we'll write base panel auth register. And we'll do the same for the other 2 pages. Okay, so now we can go back to our app.view component and summon our pages using router view. Okay, so now if I save that, you can see that we're automatically displaying the homepage component, and that's because our path is currently /. And the hashtag here is actually irrelevant. It's because we clicked on the link on the previous video, so let's remove that. So that means that we now have our base URL pointing to the homepage, which is exactly what we want. Now let's see what happens if I type /login. And yep, as we expected, we can see the auth login component. And the same goes for the register page. Okay, so now we've done it. We've got multiple pages inside our single page application. So now I want us to, when we click on the Paparazzi logo, the login button or the register button, it automatically updates the page to be homepage, auth login, and auth register, respectively. Okay, so to do that, we need to go back to our navbar and make our link point to the right pages. And there are 2 ways of doing this. We can either use the router link component provided by View Router, or we can use any tag and access the router option inside a listener. So we can say @click. And then router.push login. The equivalent of that using router link would be to login. Except that by default, a router link will become an A tag. So if you'd wanted it to be a div instead, you'd have to write tag equals div. And now those 2 things are equivalent. You can also call a route by its name, which is helpful if you decide to change the path later on. So we can do that by providing an object here instead. So we'll say name auth login. And you can do the same with the push method of the router instance. Okay, so when defining links in our navbar, we'll be using router link because it's got some helpful features like active class, which enables you to provide classes when the page is actually on display. But sometimes in our application, we'll also need to be using the router push methods. And that will be useful when we want to dynamically redirect the user. For example, when we need to redirect the user to the homepage after it's being logged out. Okay, but for now, let's stick to router link. So let's delete those 2 and replace our A tags here with router link. We can now remove those href attributes and define the 2 attributes. So the first one will point to auth login and the second one to auth register. So now if I save this and click on login, Not only our page is now showing the auth login component, but our path has also been changed to /login. And the same goes if I click back to register. Now, as I said, the router link component has a helpful attribute called active class. So let's use that here. And we'll use it to make the text blue when the page is being displayed. Okay, so as you can see, we're showing the register page, so the register button is being highlighted in blue. And if I click to the login button to display the login page, the button is now blue as well. Okay, so now all we have to do is to use router link for the paparazzi button here. So that button is actually a flex container, so we want to make sure that we keep the div tag when we use router link. So let's do that. Router link, and we'll specify tag equals div. Next, we need to define the two attributes, so to home page. Okay, so now if I save this, I can click on the paparazzi button to reach the home page. Okay, so before we wrap up, let's have a look at what we did in this episode. We started by installing Vue Router, which we immediately used in our app.js file. We decided to define our router using a webpack alias that points to the router directory. This directory has an index.js file, which defines the router options, but also initialize the Vue Router plugin. Next, we defined our routes in a separate file, and we defined 3 routes, one for the home page, one for the login page, and one for the registration page. Next, we created those new pages and summoned them in our app.vue component using router view. Finally, we updated our navbar component, and we associated its button to the relevant pages using router link. Okay, so now that our front-end routing is ready, we'll design our authentication pages in the next episode.